Welcome to the Conscious Living Podcast, conversations to educate, empower, and enlighten our world. An uplifting and inspiring series of conversations and talks with your host, Jackie Woodside. We are educating minds, empowering lives, and enlightening souls to create a world where love prevails. In this engaging podcast, we deliver exciting, positive, transformative talks and teachings designed to elevate your life. Now, let's join our host, Jackie Woodside, for this week's session.
Hi, everybody. Jackie Woodside again with the Conscious Living Podcast. As you now know very well, we are here to educate, empower, and enlighten our world. So thank you for your interest and your commitment to that. I am here today with a new friend and colleague that I actually heard on a podcast that one of my coaching clients sent to me about 2 or 3 months ago. And I was so taken with his perspective and his teaching as being so unique that I wasn't even finished with the podcast yet, and I reached out to Rob and asked him to be on the Conscious Living Podcast. So Rob Krecak is an expert in actually a number of areas. He's an expert in physical well-being and CrossFit and physical fitness. He's an expert in business and entrepreneurship. But why I have him on the show today is that Rob has developed an expertise around the impact of the digital age, technology, and social media on our world. And it's an area that I'm fairly passionate about myself, where I feel like so much of our world today is actually going more unconscious because of the way that social media and other forms of digital technology are taking over our lives. So I was thrilled that Rob said yes, and I'm happy to invite him onto the show today. Rob, help our listeners get to know you a little bit more than what I said.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jackie, for having me. I really appreciate being on the show and really grateful to be here today. I guess my background is kind of unusual. I sort of say that I have career ADD, right? So I used to be a sell-side equity analyst, which means that I analyzed and researched healthcare stocks, specifically pharmaceutical and medical device companies. So this kind of gave me an understanding of, the stock market, US business, and how to analyze a company. But I left that career because I just didn't feel like I was helping people enough. And so I also went on to open 3 Anytime Fitness health clubs and then 4 uBreakiFix cell phone repair stores, as well as a tech startup to help small businesses. So my background is kind of business and finance, health and fitness, and then technology. And it sounds weird because those are totally disparate areas that aren't necessarily related. And this new company that I have, Humans First, actually combines all of them. And that's why I think that this perspective is very unique. The mission for Humans First is to help people understand how technology is impacting their mental health, relationships, and productivity at work through better technology mindfulness. And so this is kind of a combination of, I say it's like a combination of biology, psychology, technology, and sociology all at once. And I think that people generally only look at 1 or maybe 2 of these areas, but I've combined studies in all 4 of them. And, over the past 4 years, I've read over 100 books and nearly 2,000 articles and studies to be able to bring this information to you today. And I'm really excited that then what my company does ultimately is we help other companies transition officially from a 5-day work week to a 4-day work week with no loss in productivity or profitability.
Wow, that's a great selling point, dude. Absolutely. So I so appreciate your commitment, your passion, and Rob, also your integrity. One of the things that I teach a lot about conscious living and my life design course and curriculum for conscious living is the importance of people actually aligning how they live with what they value. And what you said early on is that, you were in technology, we were in finance, but you've just had this calling, this desire to help more people. And instead of feeling that desire, you actually did something about it. So I want to acknowledge you for that. And certainly it makes us have a lot of the same vibe, the same values. So let's dive in with this topic of technology and its impact. So I'm just going to open the floor there. What do you have to say to us? I know I've read a few of your blog posts, which are very good on your website, Human First. But dive in there, Rob. What are you seeing in these hundreds of books and thousands of studies that you've read?
Yeah, there's so many things that we could talk about. And the interesting thing, if you think about it, is technology has the capacity to impact virtually every area of our life because we are using it so much.
Right.
So it's not surprising then that I can literally make a case for it impacting almost anything. But here's kind of the way that I would just, if I had to summarize the last 4 years of my work in a couple sentences, it would be this. I believe that technology is simultaneously increasing our day-to-day and sometimes minute-to-minute stress that we experience, while at the same time lessening our ability to deal with that stress because it's degrading the social bonds, communities, and networks that we have in our world.
Okay,
and
wait.
So,
you said so much right there. So can you say that, can you say that sentence again? And like each part of it, I have a question about. So just,
of course.
Yeah. So can you repeat that? The first part?
Yeah, absolutely. So what technology is doing, it is increasing the emotional and psychological stress that we experience on a day-to-day or even minute-to-minute basis.
All right. So I want to hear more about that. So it's increasing our stress, and then continue with the sentence, because there was one other thing I want you to expand on.
And while it's doing that at the same
degrading
time,
our ability
it is
to
actually
handle.
lowering our ability to deal with that stress because it is degrading our relationships and connections with other people, which is our social support system, which is one of the main ways that we buffer against stress as humans.
All right. So let's just break that down. That was just brilliant, really, Rob. So the first part, it's increasing our stress. Let's talk about that. Then you said it's decreasing our ability to handle stress. And then thirdly, it's degrading our social relationships. So let's dive into all three of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about, we were kind of talking about meditation a little bit earlier. So if you think about meditation, right, as what kind of one of the main ways that humans can improve their mental state, let's say. And the reason why meditation is good is that it brings us into the present. It doesn't focus on the past. It doesn't focus on the future. It is allowing us to be present in this moment. And that's one of the main reasons why meditation is beneficial. Well, if you think about what technology does, it's like the anti-meditation. It essentially takes us out of the present moment all the time with all these constant interruptions. It's interruptions from our phone. It's interruptions from our computer. It's interruptions from our tablet, from our TV. I could literally name a dozen things,
your
right?
smartwatch,
especially,
right?
which I find almost just crazy. But so here's the statistics, right? So the average person gets 64 smartphone notifications per day. That's once every 15 waking minutes. The average person, when they're working, also checks their email and messaging inboxes like Slack once every 6 minutes. So we're basically interrupting ourselves or being interrupted by technology constantly the entire day. And here is what happens physiologically. This is so important. What happens is when we get those interruptions, it activates our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight system that helps keep us alive. This is a good system because 5,000 years ago, when we were cavemen and cavewomen, if a saber-toothed tiger attacked our family, our fight or flight system gets activated so that it can get us out of that situation and help us survive.
Right.
But we don't need that system to be activated all the time, because what happens when it's activated all the time is adrenaline and cortisol are released, and in a large amounts because of all this constant technology activation, notification. It is actually super damaging to basically every tissue in our body because it's a systemic, phenomenon, this stress response that we have, this fight or flight response. And so it is, it sounds almost unbelievable, but I believe that how much and how we use technology and the stress response it is precipitating in our bodies is the root cause of like the majority of the problems in our life. But we don't even realize that this is happening to us, like I said, literally on a minute-to-minute basis.
Right. And that's, why I wanted you on the show. That is unconscious living. Mm-hmm. It's happening to us. It's happening to our neurology. And we don't even know it's happening. That is the definition of unconscious living. One of the things I say about this era, Rob, is that our neurology has not been able to keep up with technology. No, so there's, we are in an evolutionary jump time where our external world has changed dramatically in the past 10 to 20 years. with the advent of the technological and social media era. It's changed dramatically, but human biological, neurological evolution does not happen that quickly.
No.
So we are the first generation to be like at the forefront, and our brains neurologically simply cannot keep up with the constant stimulation. As you were talking, I was like, okay, so we're stimulated all the time, but why does that release cortisol and adrenaline? So so what's your thought about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me give you just a very simple example, which again, like people don't realize this is happening all the time. So again, the average person checks their Slack and email messaging inboxes once every 6 minutes. So this is happening once every 6 minutes. Here's what happens. So let's pretend you open up your email inbox and you have 150 unread emails, right? And it's the beginning, let's say it's Monday morning, okay? You just came in from the weekend. So you open up your email inbox, 150 unread emails. You look at this and you start saying to yourself, oh my God, there's so many emails, right? That I have so much to do. You start getting kind of anxious or nervous about all these things you have to do. There's all these people that want stuff. I have all these tasks. I have all these meetings. And so what does that do? That precipitates a sensation of being overwhelmed.
Right.
Well, overwhelm is terrible for humans because we interpret overwhelm as a loss of control. And there's three fundamental things that all humans need: autonomy or control, mastery or perceived progress in things, and purpose or connectedness. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And so, but the most important of those things is autonomy, because if we're not autonomous, we cannot survive. We can't take actions to survive as a species or as an individual. And so we look at this email inbox, we get overwhelmed. Our body subconsciously interprets that sense of overwhelm as a loss of control, and then it initiates this fight or flight response.
Right, it's danger.
We
it
see
interprets
it as a threat.
Right, it interprets it as being a risk, a threat to our well-being.
Exactly,
to our very survival.
And so we're putting ourselves, we are essentially telling our body every 6 minutes, there is a threat, there is a threat. It would be like if a robber broke into your house and held a gun to your head once every 6 minutes. Obviously that would be traumatic. That would be, an untenable situation, but we are essentially doing that to ourselves every workday when we check our email once every 6 minutes.
Absolutely. I wrote a book about that, by the way. We didn't talk about that before we got on today. I wrote a book about overwhelm called Calming the Chaos.
Oh my God. So I'm like, you obviously understand this way better than me. I have a
coaching program around that as well. So I absolutely agree with you. So then, so we're kind of in this constant fight, flight, or freeze mode. We're constant feeling of overwhelm. And I hear this all the time from coaching clients of mine. And I have to say, even though I teach it, I have to really work with my inner world to not be, it's almost like we're on that inner tube being floated down the river, right?
Sure.
The river of chaos and overwhelm, which is the mindset, the cultural mindset that we're living in, and we're just being, taken down the river with it. So the first part I'm really getting, that this constant need, they need me for something. I've got to deliver something. I have to respond to something. Every 6 minutes is a constant state of heightened adrenaline, heightened cortisol. So then you said, and technology also kind of eats away at our, or how we use technology maybe, or our lack of adaptation to technology. It's not the technology itself, right? It's how we're using it. So I want to make that distinction. But you said it eats away and decreases our ability to manage stress. And then the third piece, it hurts our social relationships. So go to those two.
Yeah. So what happens on a physiological level is when we perceive a threat, our amygdala is a structure in our brain. There's two of them, one on each side. It activates this stress response, right? And and again, we learn the stress response because it's an adaptation to survive from ancient times. Well, the more that and I'm sure that you understand this, but I'm obviously going to explain it to the listeners, the more that the amygdala is activated, the more sensitive it becomes to future threats. And so let's say, I've never used technology before and I look at social media, I'm probably not going to perceive a ton of threats. But if I use technology all the time and my amygdala makes this threat response very sensitive, now the threshold for me to be activated and have this fight or flight response is much lower. And therefore I'm going into fight or flight even more often. It's actually like a downward spiral that isn't good. And so all the activation by technology makes us more sensitive to technology and makes us go into fight or flight even more often. And so if we do not practice mindfulness or being conscious and understanding these things that are happening to us, it actually precipitates more anxiety and eventually even depression. And this is why, so I truly
we're
believe that
seeing
this
that
is the
all around us, right? With teenagers, look at this,
totally.
the spike of
Oh,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just
yeah.
think that's so important that we look at that. You're not blowing smoke here. We have so much good data, despite what the technology companies want to say. There's so
Right.
much good data about the spike in anxiety and depression.
Well, and so Jackie, I believe that the reason that this is not common knowledge is, first of all, it's somewhat difficult to construct a study that is, that very clearly, proves this. But you could say that about a lot of studies. But the other thing is, think about our economy. Okay. Over 20% of the value of our stock market is the NASDAQ, tech companies, and the top 5 most valuable companies in the United States are tech companies. So if it was very explicitly proven that technology was damaging our mental health and our relationships and our productivity at work, there's trillions of dollars at stake, and people would, trillions of dollars in market cap could be wiped out because people would not use technology as much. And so there's an extremely strong bias against showing people this information or letting people or helping them understand that this is true, because these tech companies, it goes against their business model.
Right.
And I understand why they don't want that to come out, but I think we're coming to a point where there are people in Silicon Valley that freaking know that this is happening. They know that this is bad for us, and they're still continuing to design products and services that mess us up. And I morally think that's totally ridiculous. And it's really disgusting to me, actually.
Yeah. There's an annual conference called HabitCon. I'm sure you're well aware of it. It's a conference for designers to learn about how to make their products more habit forming.
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely. There's a book by Nir Eyal called Hooked. He basically goes through the psychology behind how to make all these products addictive.
Exactly right. All right. So then it goes toward our social relationships. So it impacts an increase in our stress. It degrades our ability to manage stress. And then you're also saying it impacts our social relationships. Certainly, the divide in our country over the last 5-ish, 10 years has been so incredibly pronounced. And it's proven that social media is a big part of that. So what are you seeing, Rob? What have you learned about that?
Well, first I want to talk about something very specifically, because I think it's so important that the listeners understand this. And then I'll talk about the topic more broadly. But this truly is this part of the topic is the entire reason I created my company, Humans First. And one of the statistics is, and this is a pre-pandemic statistic, this is not including COVID. Before COVID, the average person in America spent 12 hours and 21 minutes per day in front of screens and media. Let me put it to you this way. We are spending 3/4 of every waking hour of our lives, including the weekend, in front of screens and media. This is nuts. Screens don't exist in nature. Anything that humans do evolutionarily has to serve one of two purposes. It either has to help us survive or it has to help us reproduce. And screens don't inherently do either of them. And so it's not surprising to me that if we're spending 3/4 of our life doing something that doesn't serve us evolutionarily, it's not going to be good for us. But this is not registering. So here's one I think is one of the main causes of the reason that relationships are being degraded today. So Facebook has a network built of 2.9 billion people. And in America, over 50% of the US population logs onto Facebook daily, every single day. So if you think about it, there is basically nothing, not a single thing on the whole planet that everyone does 50% of the day, every day. And so it is, obviously, this is an insane influence on our society, on relationships and everything. Well, let me tell you a little bit about what happened with something that came out recently from Frances Haugen, this Facebook whistleblower, last October. what she showed is, and proved, this is not speculation, this is proven, is that in 2018, so 4 years ago, Facebook's internal team, an internal research team at Facebook, came to Mark Zuckerberg and said, hey, Mark, we have some really critical information for you. There was two main pieces of information. The first one is that they understood that the Facebook algorithm was causing especially teens to become depressed and anxious based on the content it was showing teens on the platform. It was causing them to be depressed and anxious. A lot of them too, like over 50%.
Oh my gosh.
Then the other thing that this internal team at Facebook showed was that they also realized that their algorithm was showing people negative and divisive commentary and posts, especially political posts, because the more negative and divisive the post, the more likely it would be that people would engage and spend more time on the platform, which means that Facebook makes more money, and therefore Facebook gets, and Mark Zuckerberg get richer. And so, but the craziest thing about all this is, after Mark Zuckerberg was made aware of both of these critical pieces of information, do you know what he did? Freaking nothing. He literally said, I'm going to cash in on the mental health of teens and our entire country and become more rich and screw up people's lives because I'm greedy and I want to and I don't want to change the algorithm. He did nothing to change this. And so for 4 years, our country has literally been pitted against each other in mass every day by Facebook and made to feel more depressed and anxious by this platform. And 50% of people are logging onto this platform and doing this to themselves every day.
I'm assuming the same is true for Facebook and Instagram, right?
Instagram is actually worse than Facebook because it's more visually based. And so it actually, because of upward social comparison and body comparisons, especially with teens who have very fragile self-esteem and egos, it actually that is worse for them than Facebook because of all the visual nature of Instagram, which is owned by Facebook.
Right. That's why I was making that comparison. And now TikTok is the biggest social media platform that's not only visual, it's videos. So I know I have a teenage son, so I'm living through this hell, if you will, of what we are doing to these kids. We limit our son's phone and media access to 5 hours a day. And if he goes over that, he loses an hour the next day. So we are actively engaged in this dialogue all the time about the impact of media. Something you haven't talked about, Rob, that I'll just add to it. And then my next question is going to be, what do we do? So you can think about that while I'm saying this. But the thing that you haven't talked about is the dopamine overload, that especially for kids whose brains are still developing, the constant hit, dopamine being the reward neurotransmitter, the feel-good chemical in our brain. So what I see with my son and with, I think, a lot of teenagers today is, quote unquote, nothing feels as good as the constant stimulation of, of the social media novelty, new thing, what's going to come next? Am I going to hear from my friend? And let's not even get started on pornography, because that's a whole other conversation, but it's not. I mean, so when you have this constant positive reinforcement stimulation, your dopamine is overfiring, and that's like, oh, let's go for a hike.
Yeah.
Right?
So I'm glad you mentioned that, Jackie. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about the brain chemistry behind this. So let's just talk about three main chemicals. There's many, obviously, they're involved, but we'll talk about dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. So dopamine, like you said, is this reward chemical that kind of keeps us motivated. But I believe the reason that we have it, and basically almost every organism on Earth has a dopamine system, is because it helps us search for and find food. And again, that helps us stay alive. So this reward system is incredibly ancient and is very, very hardwired into us. It's incredibly responsive, and it's basically like a critical part of who we are as humans. But then there's serotonin, which is basically like a social binding chemical that allows us to feel pride and talk to other people. And it feels, it also is involved in a lot of other brain functions. And then oxytocin, which is like a like a social support chemical.
Yeah.
It makes us feel good and supported
Connection.
and loved and cared for.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what happens is almost all, I'm not, and this is a generalization, but almost all technology essentially plays to our dopamine system and essentially hijacks that or tries to access that. And so because dopamine is based on reward, and again, we needed it in ancient times to survive, we like the feeling of dopamine. Dopamine, by the way, is also what's released when we do drugs, for instance, illegal drugs or even not illegal drugs, right? So like so many things affect this dopamine system.
And gambling as well.
Gambling, exactly.
Yeah.
And so technology has the scale and ability to hijack this dopamine system unlike anything else we have ever experienced in the world before. And so what happens is people in the moment prefer the they have this sensation of liking when their dopamine system is active, like when you're scrolling on social media. But what they don't realize is it's coming at the cost of less serotonin and less oxytocin. Let me just give you an example. So for instance, when I text my mom and say, "I love you, Mom," via text message, she doesn't really, that I'm sure that she appreciates that, but she interprets that very differently than if I would call her on the phone and say, "I love you, Mom." And she also interprets that very differently than if I gave her a hug in person and said, "I love you, Mom." So when I give my mom a hug and tell her I love you, it releases all this oxytocin and serotonin. And when I text my mom, "I love you," it basically doesn't release much or any of that. And it's different for different people in different situations. But the point is that our society as a whole is going toward all these dopamine-based interactions at the expense of oxytocin and serotonin-based interactions. And the amount of oxytocin that our bodies have or releases is a way for us to deal with or buffer stress, because it's activated with the parasympathetic nervous system. And so if we don't have this oxytocin from, talking to people on the phone or hugging them or seeing them in person, it actually lessens our ability to deal with stress, which is, again, super bad for us because stress is also going up at the same time.
Right. Oh, it's so, so, so important. So I could go on for hours. I'm definitely going to have you on again, but I'm feeling a little bit despairing. I have to say, I'm noticing, my vibe is kind of going down as we talk about this. So let's wrap up today, Rob. You are an expert at this and helping people know, what do we do? It's not, for me as a coach, as a public, speaker, thought leader, I have to be out in front of people. So for people like myself, or people who they want to stay in touch with their second and third cousins from Idaho, like whatever, they're like, okay, I hear you, but I'm not going to give up my social media. So what can we do? What is your advice to people?
Yeah, there's a list of like many dozen, some small, some big things that I recommend to people. But the general thing that I say is that it's much easier to structure your life in a way that is conducive to good technology use as opposed to relying on willpower. Let me give you an example of that. So let's say I said to you, Jackie, hey, I see you have Instagram on your phone. I'd like to try to have you reduce your Instagram use, right? And so I could just say to you, hey, why don't you just be mindful about it and stop using Instagram and only use it for 2 hours a day? Well, obviously you probably have the capacity to do that, but it's really difficult to do, especially if you're a kid who has less executive functioning and control and decision-making ability than an adult. And so, for most people, if you say to them, hey, don't use Instagram for more than 2 hours a day, they're just not going to be able to do that because their willpower isn't as strong as the efforts of tens of thousands of engineers who have made Instagram addictive. Right. And
willpower is a muscle.
Right. Yeah. And it's a finite resource that, wanes as we go throughout the day. So maybe you're good in the morning, but by the 9 o'clock when it's bedtime, you're like, I'm just going to keep scrolling because I just think it feels good. You're out of willpower. And so so what I recommend is, again, being very intentional and deliberate about how you structure your technology and its use. And so one of the things that I suggest to people is, as an interim step, and I'll talk about the final step in a second, but as an interim step, take Instagram and move it from the front page of your phone, the home page that you first see when you open up, and move it all the way to the back.
Nice.
And so now, so I'm not saying you can't use Instagram, but what it will do is it will force you to have a bunch of steps to get to Instagram. There'll be more friction. Technologists don't want friction because it reduces use of their product. So if I introduce more friction, it will probably reduce use of the product.
Right.
So as you're scrolling through the list of, apps and getting to the very end of the homepage or end of your apps page, then you should be saying to yourself, why am I trying to use Instagram right now? What am I doing? Am I bored? Do I want to use it for something else? Do I really need to be on there? And you could be asking yourself that as you scroll. So that's one way you could structure your situation to be helpful. But another way, and which to me seems way more impactful, but way less people are willing to do, is, and just hear me out before you freak out, listeners, I would actually delete social media completely from your phone, but knowing that you can use it still in an infinite amount and whenever you want from a laptop or a computer. So now with a deleted